Let's dive right in. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Two creation stories right there side by side in the Bible. And you've probably read them. But here's what's wild, they don't exactly tell the same story. Now, before you say, wait, isn't this all part of one big seamless narrative? Hold on, let's look closer. In Genesis 1, we have this cosmic, orderly account of creation. It's structured, it's methodical. 6 days, one after the other. First, light is created, light before the sun, by the way, which is weird, right? Then the separation of waters, dry land, plants, animals, and finally, on day 6, humanity, male and female. It's a God who stands above everything, speaks things into existence, and sees that it's all good. A powerful, transcendent being, creating from a distance, but then Genesis 2 comes along, and it's like you're suddenly in a different movie. It starts with a barren earth, no plants, no rain, and no people. God steps down from the heavens, gets his hands dirty, literally forms Adam from the dust, and breathes life into him. But God in Genesis 2 is more intimate, hands-on, and what happens next? God plants a garden, then creates animals, and later, after realizing Adam's alone, makes Eve from his rib. The whole sequence feels so different. It's personal, almost experimental, and unlike the distant, all-powerful God of Genesis 1, this God is involved, responsive, like he's figuring things out as he goes. So why the difference? The stories seem to be two different portrayals of God, creation, and humanity. In Genesis 1, man and woman are created together in God's image, equal. But in Genesis 2, Adam is made first and Eve comes later, almost like an afterthought. That's a pretty big shift in tone, right? Scholars have been debating this for centuries. These aren't just two versions of the same story. These are two distinct stories that somehow got mashed together in one book. Genesis 1 comes from a different tradition than Genesis 2, likely written by different groups in different times for different reasons. Well, it forces us to question the idea that the Bible is a seamless, flawless narrative. If you've been taught that the Bible is one consistent story from start to finish, these two creation accounts throw a wrench in that idea. They suggest something much more complex, something that doesn't quite fit into the neat little package we've been sold for centuries. These stories weren't just dropped out of heaven. They were written by people with different perspectives, different agendas, and for some reason both got included in the final text. Now let's talk about the names. In Genesis 1, the word used for God is Elohim. It's a powerful, commanding title. But here's where it gets interesting. Elohim is actually a plural word. That's right, plural. But don't get too caught up thinking there were multiple gods running around, because the verb forms in the Hebrew text are singular. What's going on here? Why use a plural word for a singular god? Some scholars argue that this points back to ancient Israelite beliefs, before they became strictly monotheistic. Elohim might have been a leftover from a time when people believed in many gods but focused on just one, kind of like a transition phase in their theology. Think about it, polytheistic cultures were everywhere in the ancient world. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, gods all over the place. And then, right in the middle of it, the Israelites are carving out this idea of one supreme deity. But the language, the culture, it still carries traces of that earlier, polytheistic worldview. Now fast forward to Genesis 2. The name shifts. Suddenly, it's not just Elohim, it's Yahweh Elohim, Lord God in most English translations. This isn't just a change in title, it's a change in the entire vibe. Yahweh is personal, it's the covenant name, the name God gives when he's making a promise to his people. So what's the deal with these two names? Why does the Bible use two different terms for God? The answer might lie in the source materials. You see, Genesis 1 is thought to come from a priestly tradition, a group focused on structure, order, the big cosmic picture. Genesis 2 comes from a different tradition, the Yahwist tradition. These people were all about the personal relationship with God. Yahweh isn't just some distant deity, he's right there in the dirt, forming man from the dust, walking in the garden. This shift in language signals a shift in how God is being portrayed. So we've got two different traditions, two different names for God, and two different ways of looking at creation. Elohim is the God of power, the God of the universe, the God who creates everything with a word. Yahweh is the God who is close, the God who gets involved, who walks with humanity. The Bible keeps both of these views side by side. But why? It's not a mistake. It's not an oversight. These texts were compiled together for a reason. It reflects the evolution of how ancient people saw their relationship with the divine. Sometimes God is transcendent, above everything, and other times he's intimate, personal. The two stories, the two names, represent different aspects of how humans have understood the divine over time. Let's get into something even more intriguing, the sources behind these creation accounts. Because these two stories didn't just pop out of nowhere. They come from different traditions, different voices within ancient Israelite culture. And trust me, this changes everything about how we understand Genesis. What we're looking at here is something called the documentary hypothesis. I know that sounds academic, but stay with me, it's actually fascinating. This theory suggests that the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis, weren't written by just one person, like Moses, but by different authors from different time periods. These texts were later stitched together to create what we now call the Torah. So let's break this down. Genesis 1? Genesis 1? That's typically attributed to what scholars call the P source, or priestly source. These guys were all about order, hierarchy, and ritual. Their creation story reflects that everything happens in a structured, step-by-step process over 6 days. It's almost liturgical, like a cosmic temple is being built. That's why Genesis 1 feels so formal, so distant. It's God as a supreme architect, designing the universe with precise, deliberate actions. But Genesis 2? That's a whole different vibe. It's from what's called the J source, or Yahweh source. The Yahwist writers weren't priests, they were storytellers. They weren't interested in the big cosmic picture as much as the personal human experience. That's why the God in Genesis 2 feels so much closer, more involved. He's not just speaking things into existence from a distance. He's shaping Adam with his hands, breathing life into him, walking in the garden. This is a God who's present, who interacts directly with humanity. These two sources didn't come from the same time period. The Yahweh's tradition is older, probably written during the early days of the monarchy in Israel, maybe around the time of King David. Meanwhile, the priestly source comes later, after the Israelites were exiled to Babylon. So these are two distinct versions of Israelite history and belief written centuries apart. Why does this matter? Because it shows that the Bible wasn't just written in a vacuum. It was shaped by the political, social, and religious circumstances of its time. The priestly writers were living through the Babylonian exile, a traumatic, world-shattering event. Their creation story reflects a desire for order in the face of chaos. It's no wonder their God is so powerful, so in control. But the Yahwist, their world was different. They were focused on the intimate relationship between God and his people because they were in a period of growth, nation building. And yet these two sources, despite their differences, were both preserved, woven together into the Genesis we have today. Why? Because they both offered something important. One gave a vision of divine power, the other gave a sense of divine closeness. And that's what makes this so radical. The Bible isn't one unified voice, it's a conversation, a debate, even, between different groups with different perspectives on who God is and how the world came to be. All right, let's talk about Adam and Eve, specifically the strange way they show up in these two different creation accounts. Now, one, you might have noticed something interesting. Man and woman are created at the same time. The male and female, he created them. Boom. Done. It's quick, it's clean, and there's no mention of Adam or Eve specifically. They're just created together, both in the image of God. It almost feels like a statement of equality, right? But then we get to Genesis 2, and suddenly the whole story changes. Here, Adam is created first. He's formed from the dust of the earth, given the breath of life, and placed in the Garden of Eden. Eve doesn't show up until later, and how is she made? She's created from Adam's rib, essentially part of him. Now, this isn't just a minor narrative difference, it's a huge shift in the way humanity is framed. Here's the thing, Genesis 1 almost feels progressive by ancient standards. Man and woman, both made in God's image, both created together. But Genesis 2? That's a whole different story, literally. In this version, Adam is central. Eve is an afterthought, created to solve a problem, Adam's loneliness. And let's not sugarcoat it. This is where a lot of the traditional patriarchal views come from, the idea that woman was created for man, secondary to man. This version of creation has been used for centuries to justify everything from gender roles to societal hierarchies. But should it? Scholars have argued that Genesis 2 was likely written to reflect a more patriarchal worldview that developed later in Israelite society. It wasn't just about telling the story of creation, it was about reinforcing the social structures of the time. By making even extension of Adam, the story sets up a narrative where women are seen as dependent on men, created for men. It's subtle, but it's powerful, and this might explain why the two accounts were kept together despite their differences. The priestly account in Genesis 1 could represent an older, possibly more egalitarian tradition. But the Yahwist account in Genesis 2 reflects a society where men were dominant and women's roles were defined by their relationship to men. Now, let's dig into something that really messes with the way we usually think about the Bible, the order of creation. If you've been paying attention, the timeline in Genesis 1 is pretty straightforward. God creates the universe in 6 days and everything happens in a clear sequence, first the heavens and the earth, then plants, animals, and finally, on day 6, humanity. It's orderly. It makes sense. But flip over to Genesis 2 and suddenly the order's all over the place. In this account, Adam is created first before any plants or animals. The whole setup feels less structured and more reactive. God forms Adam from the ground, then realizes Adam needs food, so he makes plants. Then he notices Adam is lonely, so he creates animals, and when that doesn't work out, finally he creates Eve. It's like the creation story just went from a perfectly executed plan to a series of on-the-fly decisions. Why this shift in focus? Why does Genesis 2 feel so, well, messy compared to the clean structure of Genesis 1? One possible explanation is that Genesis 2 isn't trying to tell the same kind of story. Genesis 1 is this grand, cosmic narrative. It's God zoomed out, creating a whole universe with a word. But Genesis 2? This is God zoomed in. It's all about humanity, specifically about Adam. This story isn't interested in the stars or the galaxies. It's focused on the earth. On the garden, on this one man, and eventually this one woman. It's like going from the big picture to the personal details. But there's more to it than just a different perspective. The sequence in Genesis 2 actually changes the entire dynamic of creation. In Genesis 1, humanity is the climax, the final piece of the puzzle. The world is prepared for us and we are placed in it. But in Genesis 2, Adam is the starting point. He's the first thing created, and everything else, plants, animals, Eve, exists because of him, for him. It's a totally different way of seeing humanity's role in the world. Instead of being part of creation, Adam becomes the reason for creation. The universe revolves around him. This shift in focus might also hint at something deeper. In ancient cultures, creation stories weren't just about explaining how the world began, they were about defining humanity's place in it. Genesis 1 gives us a picture of humans as caretakers of the world, made in the image of God, responsible for the earth, but still part of the grand scheme of things. But Genesis 2? It makes humanity the center of the story. It's a narrative about control, about dominance. Adam is literally formed from the ground, and then everything else is made to suit him. What does that tell us? It suggests that these two stories are coming from very different worldviews. Genesis 1 is about harmony between humanity and creation, while Genesis 2 is about humanity's dominance over creation. And again, these two accounts are sitting right next to each other in the Bible, even though they're clearly not on the same page when it comes to what creation is all about. It's almost like these two stories are competing visions of what it means to be human. One sees us as part of a larger, balanced world. The other puts us at the center, with everything else revolving around us. And what's fascinating is that, for thousands of years, both of these stories have been preserved together, even though they offer such different perspectives. Let's dive deeper into something that might completely change the way you look at Genesis, the influence of older, ancient creation myths. Because here's the thing, the stories in Genesis didn't just appear out of nowhere. They didn't come from a vacuum. There were other civilizations around ancient Israel, and they had their own creation stories long before the Bible was written. So, when we look at Genesis, we need to ask, how much of it was influenced by these older myths? Let's start with one of the biggest parallels, the Enuma Elish. This is the Babylonian creation myth, and it's pretty wild. In this story, the god Marduk slays a chaos monster named Tiamat and uses her body to create the world. Sound familiar? It should, because Genesis 1 starts with God bringing order to the chaos, the formless and void earth, with darkness over the deep waters. The idea of a primeval, watery chaos that needs to be tamed is a theme that's shared across many ancient cultures. And the Enuma Elish, it's centuries older than Genesis. Some scholars argue that Genesis 1 is a response to these older creation myths, especially those from Mesopotamia and Babylon. Instead of multiple gods fighting for control, like in the Enuma Elish, Genesis gives us one God, Elohim, who creates the world with purpose and order, without conflict. But the bones of the story, the idea of creating from chaos, are eerily similar. Let's talk about the Epic of Atrahasis, another ancient Mesopotamian story. In this one, the gods create humans from clay, and you get this, they do it to relieve the gods from the burden of labor. Humans are made to do the work the gods don't want to do. Now, jump to Genesis 2. God forms Adam from the dust of the ground. Then, what does he do? He places Adam in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. It's almost like the Bible took this older theme, the creation of humans to tend the earth, and adapted it into a more personal story about man's relationship with God. The Garden of Eden itself seems to echo another ancient place, Dilmun, the paradise from Sumerian mythology. In the Sumerian story, Dilmun is a land where everything is pure, where there's no sickness, no death, and where the gods live in harmony. The parallels to Eden are hard to ignore. Both are places of perfection, where the first humans are placed to live in peace, until something happens that causes them to lose that perfect life. So what's really going on here? Is Genesis just a retelling of these older myths? Not quite. But what we're seeing is that the biblical writers were clearly influenced by the stories around them. They took pieces of these ancient myths and reworked them into something new, something that fit their understanding of God and humanity. Genesis isn't just a standalone creation story. It's part of a larger conversation that was happening in the ancient world about where we come from and what our role is in the universe. Now, some people get uncomfortable with the idea that the Bible might have borrowed from older stories. But here's the thing, this actually makes the text more interesting, not less. It shows that the biblical writers were engaged with the world around them, responding to the stories and ideas of their time. They weren't just copying, they were redefining what creation meant, what God's relationship to the world looked like. What if Genesis was never meant to be a single, unified story? What if the Bible is intentionally presenting us with multiple beginnings, multiple ways of seeing the world, humanity, and God? We've spent this whole time digging into the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the contrasting names for God, the different orders of creation, the cultural influences from older myths. But here's the real kicker. Maybe these differences aren't mistakes. Maybe they're the whole point. Why would ancient Israelite scribes include two different creation stories, back to back, if they were just trying to give us one straightforward account? They could have easily picked one version and stuck with it. But they didn't. They kept both stories, knowing full well that they didn't perfectly line up. And here's why that matters. Genesis isn't just telling us how the world was made. It's inviting us into a conversation about what creation means. In Genesis 1, you've got this God who is all-powerful, speaking the universe into existence with cosmic authority. It's orderly, it's grand, and it's awe-inspiring. But in Genesis 2, you get a more intimate picture, God forming man with his own hands, walking in the garden, personally involved in humanity's story. Two very different views of creation, but each one gives us a glimpse into a different aspect of who God is. By including both stories, the Bible is saying something profound. There isn't just one way to understand the divine. It's offering us multiple perspectives because God, creation, and our place in the world are too big, too complex, to be captured by just one narrative. And here's where it gets even deeper. Throughout the rest of the Bible, we see this pattern over and over again. Different voices, different perspectives, sometimes even different versions of the same story. The Bible isn't afraid of tension or contradiction. It's not about locking us into one single interpretation. It's about inviting us to wrestle with the text, to ask questions, to explore the mystery of God and creation. So what does this all mean for us? It means that when we read Genesis, we're not just looking for answers. We're engaging with a rich, multi-layered story that challenges us to think bigger, to embrace complexity, and to see the divine in new and unexpected ways. And that's where we'll leave it today. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching until the end. If you found this discussion as fascinating as we have, make sure to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next deep dive into these mind-blowing topics. As always, we appreciate each and every one of you for your support. God bless you all, and we'll see you in the next video.